And what we're discussing is Buddha's view of the world. It's a world view, basically. And seeing what we can apply from it, to hear it as tools, hear it as practical, hear it as advice. About how, essentially, about how to develop our, lessen our neuroses and grow our goodness. That's the bottom line. And we'll just sing our little prayer of refuge, the second two lines of which express this altruistic motivation that we do this activity so that we can take some tools from it, so we can develop our amazing potential, so we can help others.
Does anybody know the page?
Well, you got your prayer book, have you? 96, I think.
69.
69. Where's Chris?
I'm here.
Where are you? Oh, there you are. Okay. If you want to join in, 69. Okay. Sangye charang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chönyen gi sonam ki drola penche sangye drupa shog sangye charang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chönyen gi sonam ki drola penche sangye drupa shog sangye charang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chönyen gi sonam ki drola penche sangye drupa pasho. We're having a nice discussion when we arrived here, us helicopter passengers, when we arrived over our hot chocolate and Americano and hot water. Me and Chris and Nikki. Where is she? There she is. We were talking about animals, and Chris was shocked at this Buddhist idea. Initially, we had a little discussion. Let's just discuss it about how, you know, I quoted, I think, Lama Zopa saying at one time, we quoted Lama Zopa. This is years ago. A friend of mine, Jane, told me that Rinpoche said that if we could just for a moment have a direct experience of the mind of our little doggy woggy, you know, pussy wussy, whom we think are so divine and gorgeous and special and wonderful. I'm not being sarcastic. You know, he said, if we could just see their mind for a moment, just experience it directly, the suffering would be so unbearable that we could never bear to think of wasting another second of this precious human life. Now that's kind of shocking, isn't it? I mean, that is very shocking to us. I mean, if it's true, then it shows, if it is true, then it shows how unbelievably ignorant we are. Is it not true? But I think that's, even if we look at humans, if we don't see physical evidence of a person's mind, we don't know what's going on. We haven't got a clue. I mean, I remember even just recently one of those murderers, you know, those crazy guys in America with these multi, you know, all these guns. That fellow in the Las Vegas hotel and all the people at the rock concert, or the concert, remember? And because the first thing people do is look into his website, look into the evidence, look into his family, and everybody. They could find not a single piece of evidence in his words and in what he writes and his emails and his activities and his family. Even they dug out his brain. They could find not a millimetre of evidence of anything abnormal in anything he even said, you know. So it's like, we can't even conceive of what that means. If we can't see the evidence of it, on the face of it, the words he said, the things he did, his actions in life. But if, you know, then on the other hand, this guy in New Zealand, it was in a millisecond evident from his behaviour. Everything was naked. Do you understand what I'm saying? So therefore we could deduce what was in his mind. So we have to rely on the external. That shows how thick we are, you know. I mean, that's how we are in the West, in the modern world. We have no way. I mean, maybe we can be a bit sensitive, and a person feels a bit sad, we can get a sense of that they're sad. But unless we see some physical evidence, there's no way we can know what's going on in a person's mind. And then when you hear something like that, then that's really very shocking. So what's the meaning of that, you know? What do you mean by suffering? What does he mean by suffering? Well, this is the thing about Buddhist model of the mind. I mean, it's kind of so specific. And it takes a while to hear it, you know. And again, like I mentioned, the whole of the approach of the Buddhist view to the mind is indicated by the end result. This word Buddha in Sanskrit and the word Sangye in Tibetan, the equivalent, it tells us exactly the Buddhist view of the contents of our mind. He is saying that we've all got the potential to, one, rid the mind utterly of ego, fears, jealousy, depression, anxiety, paranoia, suffering, in other words, the stuff that causes our suffering. And on the other hand, we can develop to perfection all the goodness, which means the whole Buddhist view of the mind, there's this utter distinction between neuroses and virtues. Now, we kind of know those words. We can see people who are pretty wacko on this planet, and we know that maybe they've been kind to their wife, but they beat up someone else. We know you've got these two parts of us. We know in our own mind we have these two parts of us. But I think our views of the mind, our neuroscience, our psychology, our own instinctive feeling, is that this stuff is all called normal. Like you're normal if you get angry, jealous, depressed, low self-esteem, sad. No, the negative one. Sorry, sad is not necessarily negative. We just think that's normal. And we all know that if you're really extreme in those, then you're kind of weird. But there's no view, you know, in psychology or neuroscience that gives any possibility of ridding yourself utterly of all the neuroses. I mean, it's too shocking a concept. I'm so used to it now because that's the Buddha's view and that's the one I'm trying to work with. But I remember people, the first response is, but you'd be insane. You would be considered insane if you had no anger, no fears, no depression. So it's abstract for us. We can't conceive of it, right? But that's the particular view of the Buddhists, the Buddha's particular view about the mind, which is really quite unique. So therefore, the job of being a Buddhist, if the goal is to rid the mind of all the rubbish and grow the goodness, it's obvious from day one the goal is to learn to distinguish them, which is why you have to have concentration, good meditation skills, which is why you have to know that model well by studying it, because it's not evident, and then you start doing the looking and unpacking and unraveling this chaos in here, this mixture of all this stuff, all mixed together like a big soup. That's the job of being a Buddhist, you know. Then you can understand why. The job is to distinguish, to recognize a neurotic thought, and emotion, and learn to know what to do with it, to lessen it, and then to grow the other stuff. Essentially that, you know. So now that's the first point. But the second point that's kind of fascinating, the Buddhist view of, the Buddhist psychology, Buddhist view of the mind, and in the literature it's really extensive, really dealt with in a vast, amazing way. It applies to all sentient beings. Now, okay, the ones we can see on this planet, you know, from the elephants to the micro bugs, they're all in the animal realm. The Buddha would refer to a group of sentient beings called the animals, and clearly there's a vast spectrum of them in terms of size, experience, capability, and all the rest, you know. But the Buddha's view of the mind refers to every sentient being, including them. So if it's true then what Lama Zopa says, and if it's true what Buddha says, that you can learn to know your own mind so intimately and so well, and do this incredible development of lessening neuroses and growing goodness, which brings happiness and stops suffering, then if we can deduce that if he... What's wrong?
I think we should turn on the lights.
Okay.
Crystal, can you check?
Are they working?
It looks like... See. It's still good enough, but we'll get dark.
Are the switches around here somewhere? Up this end for this end. Are the switches up this end for this end? No. Okay. No? I mean, when it gets dark, what's the point of having a camera?
No, it's still good enough.
Oh, it's good enough.
Darker, so I'm just
okay, all right. There we go. More lights.
More than
there we go, lights. Okay, good. Okay, so therefore, if, let's say, Lama Zopa is a valid exponent and a practitioner of this stuff that we're describing here, let's just take that as a given for the moment, and if therefore it is true that he's got from his insight into the mind of an animal, which is called clairvoyance. And that is what the Buddha would say that you all can cultivate, having cultivated single point of concentration. And that we've all got the capability of doing that. That means we have to imply that he knows his own mind intimately and well. He can see the minds of others. So if that's true, then that's kind of shocking, isn't it? That the suffering of an animal. So what is it? That means, for an animal's mind, basically, the difference between a human and an animal. I mean, we share, what is it, 98% of the same DNA, I've heard, things like that. It looks like, you know, we look like a bunch of monkeys, basically, except we've not got so much hair. You know, but it looks like very similar. So what's the difference? The difference is that an animal's mind can mainly only access the ego grasping, which is the root delusion which clings to the neurotic sense of self, the attachment that comes as a result of that, the aversion that comes when attachment doesn't get what it wants, and all the other thousands of other neuroses that we've all got. But animals mainly only can access that, and not much virtue. Now, if you think of people on the planet who are called humans, who we see the evidence of not having much virtue, the wackos, the psychopaths, the ones addicted to sex, drugs, killing people, terrorists, bombers, murderers, you name it, whom we like to think of as evil, and then we think of an animal who's similar and we think of them as evil, we can't cope with that. That's too much for our mind. That was, I think, the basis perhaps of Chris's shock, because we all adore animals. But that's a really interesting point, because with an animal, if they can predominantly only access their delusions, which means that's why they are suffering so badly, and that's why they rip each other to pieces every day. I mean, look at wildlife. What do we mean? Animals living in the wild, ripping each other to pieces to eat dinner. You've got no choice. They've got no choice because the tendency is there, and because you're living in so much paranoia and fear. Can you even conceive of the level of fear that you have to live like that? Everyone, you're going to be eaten alive, otherwise you have to eat another person. So can you only imagine the suffering of that? Now, we don't call them evil, we just call it natural. But if you've got a human who does that, we call them evil, which is kind of interesting. But for the Buddha, they're both the same. They both got ego grasping, they both got attachment, they both got aggression, they both got tendencies to kill, harm, lie, steal, torture, you name it. And then the humans, look at them. I mean, we meant to have some virtue, but look at humans, how they behave. Well, that's exactly the same as an animal. But it's shocking to hear that an animal we think, oh, that's just natural, or the poor things, they can't help it. But a human, we want to hate them and think they're evil and want to kill them and rip them to pieces. So it's kind of interesting. But in the end, there's no difference for the Buddha. Well, if you have attachment, you're suffering. And if you have attachment, you get anger. And if you have anger, you harm people. So, I always think of the example, like I mentioned this morning. I was thinking in one of those animal shows, I remember a particular one, and there was the mummy lion stalking the buffalo for breakfast, Well, first of all, we bring the children in. We call it nature, don't we? We bring the children in to look, and we call it education. So there's mummy lion. She has to stalk the buffalo because that's the only method she's got. And how? Because of karmic imprints. It's her habit from the past. She could have developed these habits as a human, and then due to heavy karma of the tendency to kill, she runs like a magnet to a lion mummy's womb because it suits her nature, and now she has a body that fits the mind she's got, which is to be addicted to killing. And no choice. She can't go to the butcher shop. She can't ask someone else to do it for her. She doesn't think, I'll eat vegetables today. She's got to follow her instinct, her habit to kill. So then she gets the buffalo, and I saw this picture. I remember seeing the long distance shot of the buffalo screaming in agony, very obviously screaming in agony, having your guts ripped out, your throat first, then your guts. And then she calls her babies, and they sit down and have a leisurely breakfast over hot entrails. Now we call that nature. No one's shocked, but if you think of a human with the same kind of mind, a mind whose only choice is to go next door, stalk the neighbour, get them by the throat, rip it out, get their guts, rip them out, and then call the babies and you sit on the road and eat and enjoy breakfast, we'd know they have a serious problem. And then if you brought your children in to watch it, you'd be accused of abuse and you'd be put in jail for 100 years. So all I'm getting at purposely is showing the Buddha's view that all sentient beings want happiness, no sentient being wants suffering. We all have got countless past lives. We've all been human countless times. We've all been dogs countless times. We've got the same imprints, the same tendencies, because the bottle of the mind refers to all of us. It's a question of which ones prevail, which birth you get, which ones you act out, So the compassion for this, all is equal. We're driven by delusions. And those delusions are why we suffer, and they are why we harm others. And this becomes the basis of having compassion. Whereas our view is, for compassion, we only have compassion for innocent victims. So we call animals, we think that it's just natural. We call it natural. They're just born like this, We see them ripping each other's guts out, but it doesn't shock us. We get the camera closer to have a look how fascinating it is. So it's really fascinating, isn't it? How if you saw a human do that, we'd be absolutely hysterical. Even if you brought your cat in and you brought the children in and got the mouse and saw the cat rip the guts of the mouse out, you'd be accused of kind of torture of the children, So it's so arbitrary. Whereas if all in the one picture, though, from the Buddhist point of view, this is the nightmare of samsara. This is the nightmare of samsara. And being born as an animal, born as a lion, born as a mouse, is just infinite more suffering than a human. Humans are bad enough, our suffering. But we can at least access some intelligence, some virtue, some ability to see something from another point of view. As we were taught as children, leopards can't change their spots. It's really evident. And you can see really suffering humans are the same. You can't change their minds. They're stubborn, narrow-minded, fixated, refuse to be able to change. But that's the miracle of the human mind, if we can use it. The access to our virtue. The animal's got all the same virtuous imprints, but they're buried. While she's a lion, they're buried under her lion tendencies, her delusions. And those delusions are exactly the same. And I don't think it's too difficult to see that. Look at monkey, look how people behave, All got sexual craving to have sex, craving to put food in the mouth. Look at the dynamics in groups. You see it among humans, the power dynamics, the victims, the one who get jumped on, the power ones. Look at animals, the same thing. You can see it ticking off the boxes: attachment, aggression, anger, jealousy. You can see some animals are depressed. Some are quiet and sweet. Some are peaceful, some aggressive. It's really evident the mind is the same, you know. But they can't access their virtues. And again, as now Chris said, one thing, animals seem very much more intelligent. In some ways, senses, yeah, their senses are very developed. But that's not intelligence. Senses are like dumb animals. They don't have much access to anything else. Like that eagle or some ever can see from 1,000 feet in the sky exactly that fish, you know. But they have the third quality, the third states of mind. And they're highly developed in them, not just the senses. But you know, in this third category of states of mind, in the Buddhist model, we've got the neuroses, the delusions, the non-virtues, the ridiculous states of mind that break our hearts and cause us to harm others, that are the voices of ego. We've got the virtues that are our saving grace, which we can develop to perfection, which are the source of any happiness we have. And then we have the mechanics of the mind, that's my term for it, that like in attention, concentration. There's an ability to discriminate. Every second there's one working called discrimination. It's the ability to discriminate every second, all the different things we're seeing, pink, blue, this, that, round, square. It's a super necessary state of mind. That they're the ones that animals have very strongly. Incredible focus, incredible concentration. But they're driven by ego grasping, the same as us. They're driven by attachment, aggression, and then karmic tendencies to do what they do, you know. But that point of Rinpoche's was very kind of outrageous. It's very shocking. And that's the mind of your dog. And they're like in the God realms of the animals, you know. Little doggy who's got nothing to worry about, is adored by everybody, no fears, and yet their mind is tormented. And that's the thing that when we use this word fear, you know, I mentioned, if you look at the list of the contents of our mind in Buddhist psychology, you won't find one specifically called fear. Because fear is the character of all the delusions. And if you look at animals, what else is it but fear, you know? On that same animal show, I remember it was one of those Attenborough shows, you know? And there was one of these wonderful long shots, it was in Africa or somewhere, and the sunset, the massive sun going down, looked very beautiful. And there was this long shots of all these animals running, and with nice music, you know? And I was thinking, I wonder why they're running. I bet they're not jogging. You know, oh, let's go out for an evening jog. I don't think so. They're running in absolute terror of being eaten alive. What else? What else? So this is again back to like we said this morning before you went off. Everything comes down to view. So everybody sees the same thing. You have Richard Attenborough give his description of what he sees. Then you have Lama Zopa give his description of what he sees. It's like you're seeing two different universes. Oh, for example, Song Rinpoche, one old Lama, he's passed away now. In the 70s, when we first invited him to Europe and to the West, and one of my friends, Peter Kedge, was with him as they took him on the train going across the south of France, right by the sea. And he hadn't seen the sea before. And he looked out and saw all the people swimming. And he looked so sad. He said, oh no, he said, they've been born fish in so many lifetimes and they keep going back into the water. And that was his view of the beach. I mean, it's like, what is real in the end? It's really evident what's real. You have 6 people describe one thing and you know. I mean, you have 6 people describe you wouldn't recognize the descriptions. So it's really evident everything is view, you know. I mean, it's a miracle we have any communication at all. We actually communicate, you know. It's astonishing. So the Buddhist view is so very different in so many ways. The Buddhist view of what's going on in the mind and where it comes from, you know, and who we are. And that's what we're talking about in this. That's what we're talking about here. Buddha's view of reality, you know. So to know our own minds is obviously the first step. You know, if you can't see another person's mind, it's evidence because you don't see your own mind. And then when you hear some of the qualities that we do accomplish, if we do, you know, I forget because I just talk one place to another and I forget what I said. Have we discussed single point of concentration at all?
No. Not really.
No, we haven't. Okay, let's talk about that. Well, I was always you know, lately, a few years ago, I heard His Holiness the Dalai Lama say, and I always quote this lately. I find it so helpful. He said, it was these Indians more than 3,000 years ago who were the ones who first began the investigation into the nature of self, you know. So that really kind of, I mean, first of all, I joke and I say we thought it was Mr. Freud 100 years ago. You know, we're so arrogant in our Western culture. And then anyway, what do we know about the Indians? We go back to the Greeks, isn't it? We know all about the Greeks. Half our fancy words are in Greek. We know zero about India. And that even means all us Western Buddhists. I know nothing about India. I just know Buddhists in India and that's about it. I like the Tibetans. They're my mob, you know, the Tibetans, because they're the ones I know. I don't know any Indian Buddhists. I knew Indian was a Buddha. A Buddha was an Indian. But when you think about it and you start to look at the extraordinariness of these amazing Indians, these Hindus before the Buddha, this astonishing culture that existed. I remember on the BBC World Service one time on the radio, some archaeologists describing how in the Hindu civilization, India, they found at a certain point in their history, there was no evidence of any weapons of destruction. Any weapons, period. Now that says something astonishing about a culture, doesn't it? That's really remarkable. And if you look back at these Indians, their view of the mind, which is where Buddha gets his view from, is from these Indians. Buddha diverged from the Hindus at a certain point directly in relation to his own findings about the nature of self. He didn't throw out what he'd gone through so far. He went through this amazing system, this extraordinary philosophy, this extraordinary model of the mind, dealt with an incredible depth. He didn't chuck it all out. He went on beyond that, he would suggest, you know. So the view of karma, that's been around India for 5,000 years. The view about what the mind is. And these Indians were the ones who created, who cultivated this extraordinary, sophisticated psychological skill, which is what the world vaguely knows as mindfulness meditation, okay? And that's even just a word we've made up for it. It's actually this incredibly sophisticated ability that every human being has, because it's a skill of the mind, no, not a skill of some secret part of you called a soul. Buddha doesn't use that word. That enables you to get this super subtle focus at a subtler level of your own mind, a level of mind that we do not posit as existing in our world, in our neuroscience or our psychology, which is why we think it's mystical. But it's an incredibly sophisticated skill, you know, and it's known technically as single-pointed concentration at a level of mind that does not depend upon the brain and does not depend upon the senses. If you saw a body, if you saw a person who'd accomplished this single-pointed concentration, it's described in the texts in terms of 9 stages, and these Indians invented it before the Buddha. It was one of the key techniques in Buddhism. Buddha took it with him, you know. If you saw a person who'd accomplished this samadhi, this super subtle focus of their own mind at a subtle level, beyond conceptual, beyond sensory, they would look like they were dead, which is why we think it's mystical. But this is the view of the mind. This is the view of the mind coming from these Indians, you know. It's absolutely extraordinary. And then you read the literature about it. What blows your mind completely, the knowledge about the mind in Buddhism does not come from looking at a brain. It comes from investigating internally and subjectively the contents of your own mind based upon this super subtle, super sophisticated, super focused capacity for cognition at a very subtle level. So it's an incredibly sophisticated model. But in most Buddhists, we don't study it, you know. We don't think about it. We don't know about it. In fact, in our culture, we don't even trust the subjective. But this is exactly the Buddhist view, coming from these amazing Indians. I mean, the knowledge is so sophisticated. Anybody who starts to studies it, you know, it's really very complex. You know, Joanna's been studying it now, haven't you? You studied Low-Rig. You did both aspects. You did the psychological model and the epistemological model, the way the mind works, conceptuality and all that. You did both. It's so sophisticated, it blows your mind. You read it, you think you know what they're talking about. And it's all come from internal knowledge, from internal awareness. That does not exist in our culture, you know. It's very amazing. And this single point of concentration, for the Buddha, in order to achieve that goal that we're talking about long term, we've got to achieve this single pointedness. There's masses of work we can do before that. And most of us won't get it in this life. You've got to get, you know, you've got to really be an amazing practitioner to have the effort and the courage and the amount of work that you've done previously to give up sex, drugs and rock and roll and go to the mountains for several years to get it, you know. You can't do it at home in spare time. To actually accomplish this single pointedness is very amazing. We can practice the technique, we must. But this is internal, it's internal. That is unheard of in our culture. Even studying philosophy is kind of considered kind of low, fairly low in our culture, isn't it? You know, it's too subjective, you know. You certainly wouldn't practice it. The Buddha is exactly the opposite. So knowing our own mind is the fundamental job of being a Buddhist, to a degree of subtlety and precision that we can't imagine. And why should we do that? It's so simple for the Buddha, because everything in our mind, our views, are the source of all happiness and all suffering. It's as simple as that. That's his reason. There's no mystical reason to it, you know. It's because what goes on in the mind, the viewpoints, that when we have layers and layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of these viewpoints, we have to unpack and unravel them. That's the job of being a Buddhist from here to Buddhahood. It's a massive job, you know. So for the Buddha, the mind, which is not physical, is not a function of the brain, which is a shock to us to hear. Is not the handiwork of a creator or mummy and daddy, which is another big shock. Has far more subtle levels, is beginningless and is endless, which is even more ridiculous, and has its potential to become perfect. That's the Buddha's view. So I mean, so many different views about the mind, you might as well have another word for mind, you know. Such a radically different view. This book I'm working on at the moment for Victoria Coleman, who for years you worked with, didn't you? There's this, one of Rinpoche's Lama Zopa's projects is build these big statues of the future Buddha, Maitreya, in India. Big monumental statues, massive things. And so one of the things he got Victoria to do, starting in 2002, was to gather together all these, as they call, relics. It's very it's well known in the Catholic tradition, I think. Relics of dead yogis and things. So, you know, there's all this history, especially among the great tantric yogis, because when they purify their mind, and the particular model of the mind that's described, especially in the Vajrayana model, talks about the intimate relationship between the physical and the mental. So when the body is, you know, so when a person is very pure practitioner, that affects their internal subtle energies, which in turn makes your mind and your body both very pure. So that, you know, great meditators use their spit and their breath, for example, to heal. You can use your hands to heal. That's why your body becomes pure, because your mind purifies it. So then when you die, in your remains, they find these kind of pearl-like relics, they call. So anyway, Victoria was given the job of doing these tours of all these different Buddha's relics, hundreds of them. Relics from the Buddha, from the previous Buddha, from all these great yogis over the centuries. So Lama Zopa said just to put a book together, and I'm helping her do it. And it's just, for me, very fascinating. I've hardly seen any relics. I've hardly thought about relics. But it's utterly mind-blowing, the response from people. Absolutely mind-blowing. Ordinary people. The 2.5 million people, I think she said, or 1.5, over the 15 years, in Russia, in 57 countries, you know, people seeing these relics beautifully displayed in these little cases with lights and special things. The people moved by these experiences, ordinary people. And one of the things I'm thinking of right now is one woman who's a scientist went in with her brother just to have a look. She was completely blown out. And this is what you feel. I'm sure you can tell stories. The number of people who walk in there, skeptics, and they burst into tears. People, the number of stories about people. You can't deny their experiences, you know, being moved, they go into bliss, they cry. Some people in Russia collapse when they got the blessing from the Buddha's thing. I mean, these stories you hear, you can't doubt their experiences. It's so fascinating, you know. And the most cynical people, walking in, going out in tears. One old big fat guy didn't know what to do and he suddenly burst into tears. I didn't expect that, he said. The number of stories, it's just, I mean, it's mind-boggling, you know. So fascinating. But this particular scientist, she was so shocked by this. She couldn't doubt her own experiences. She and her brother. They're Indian. They're from India. But they're scientists. She could not get over how her mind kept completely still. She was full of bliss. All these experiences. So she was compelled herself to invite the relics and have a special thing in Los Angeles. And then she did special tests and things. But she said in her story, she said, you know, there's no question that I have to start questioning the subjective. There's no doubt. There's clear to me from the experience I had that consciousness can't be a function of the physical. And I remember even in a book that I was working on in Lama Zopa, when I was doing Lama Zopa's book about death, I read a book by an American medical journalist who's an atheist, a very funny fellow, about all the problems now, especially in the States. He was his research about since having to give organs, you know, what do you call organ donating, all the problems of not knowing really now when death really occurs. It's really confusing to people, which I think is great because it's forcing people to question their assumptions. People coming back to life, people having out-of-body experiences, all kinds of things. And as he quoted one doctor in there saying, I can now say with certainty, consciousness is not a function of the brain, you know. Don't know what it is, but I can say that much. And that's what this woman, she said, science isn't wrong. It's just that it's limited, and we're limited by our tools, which is a really good way to put it. You know, it's a really good way to put it. And that's why it's so amazing these last 30, 40 years. The Dalai Lama, he's been the inspiration behind this organisation called Mind and Life. You see their website, mindandlife.org. Then, you know, amazing conferences over the last 30, 40 years with the Dalai Lama and the best brains in the Tibetan Buddhist world, including Americans and foreigners, as well as having discussions with scientists. Many amazing things are now coming up. These, you know, seemingly completely opposite views of the world, models of the universe, people coming together, you know. I remember one Canadian scientist saying that neuroplasticity, which is coming as a result of putting, you know, wires on minds of meditators and seeing how their brains change. that he said that neuroplasticity is the greatest finding of the 20th century, meaning you're not stuck with the brain you're born with. Well, I'm glad we're now catching up with Buddha. He's been telling us for 2,500 years, you're not stuck with the mind you're born with. We can change it. So it's so good that these discussions are happening, you know. But this woman's response was very powerful, very moving. Anyway, here we're discussing Buddha's view of the mind. It's not physical. It goes to much more subtle levels. Does not the handiwork of mummy, daddy, or a creator. That's one of the biggest shocks. Because the views that seem to prevail on this planet, you either believe in God, and God's your creator, or you believe in materialism. I mean, that's it. There's really the main options, aren't they? The world knows. Okay, you've got your Australian Aboriginals. I don't understand their views. It's so subtle. You've got the American Indians, you've got all the indigenous peoples whose views aren't so well known on the planet. You've got your creator religions, you know, your what are they called? Abrahamic religions, your Jews, your Muslims, and your Christians. And then you've got your materialists, the philosophical materialists. And that's the prevailing view on the planet. And says, mummy and daddy made you. All our science is based on that. All your psychology is based on that. You track yourself back to mummy and daddy, grandma, grandpa, and the monkeys, isn't it? Body, for your body, yep, Buddha agrees with your body, no problems, but not your mind. So because of this, because this is so natural to us, we have these views in our mind now, let's say all the views about animals, I mean, because they're so just naturally ingrained with this, we've been brought up with these views, and this is what's interesting about a view. I think we don't think we have a view. We just think what we think is true. Everyone's like that. This is a really powerful point. Because we're brought up a certain way, we just believe what we're told, and we get brought up, and we just accept that as a view. So if you decide to change, you know, then you suddenly become a Muslim, then you suddenly change your views, and then you're considered to be weird because now you believe in some wacko thing, whereas before you're normal. So if you get brought up in a Christian world, you're normal, then you become a Buddhist, you're wacko. You're brought up in a materialist world, you're normal. Do you see my point? So but the Buddhist point is, and it's so clear, they're all simply viewpoints. Materialism is a really elaborate, sophisticated presentation of the universe based on the view the mind is the brain. Do you understand my point? That's what it is, you know. Buddha's view, radically different. The Vajrayana model of the mind, so fascinating, the one that the Tibetan medical system is based on. Completely different view of the universe. And that's the Buddhist view of the world, the Buddhist view of karma. That's been in India for thousands of years. That's just in the bones of their being, like for us, materialism is in the bones of our being. So the key thing that I found, becoming a Buddhist, you know, you're forced to look into your mind. If you don't have to. I wanted to. I wanted to take on Buddha's view as my working hypothesis. This is the way I'm saying it. And every time you get to a certain view in here, you bump against the Buddha's one. And I'm because I want to take on Buddha's views as mine. So you're all the time forced to question your assumptions, you know, which is a really good exercise. Because the Buddha's deal is also what's fascinating. Buddhism, you can present it, one, as a method for stopping suffering, getting happiness. From beginning to end, it is validly that. Two, you can say it is a system of ethics. From beginning to end, it is exactly that. But three, it is also can be said to be a method of stopping being ignorant and getting wisdom. And you know what? They all come to the same thing. That's what's fascinating. Buddha's saying the extent to which you're unethical, the extent to which you're dominated by attachment and anger and fears and jealousy. One is the extent to which you're unhappy. Two is the extent to which you're ignorant. And three is the extent to which you, what was the third one? You're ignorant, you're unhappy, and the third one, oh, you're not being ethical. So the extent to which you're not ethical is the extent to which you suffer, and is the extent to which you're ignorant. It all comes down to the same thing. So the job of being a Buddhist is to stop harming others, stop being unethical and be ethical, which also brings wisdom, which also brings happiness. They all come to the same thing. And that's what's fascinating. If we look at our world, you know, you think of a genius scientist who knows everything, like an absolute genius. Well, she'll still go home and beat her husband up because we see wisdom as having zero to do with ethics. We see art. We revere artists, great artists. You know, they can be wackos. Whereas for the Buddha, you can't possibly have wisdom if you don't have ethics, and you can't possibly therefore suffer, and therefore you couldn't possibly harm another. They're all completely integrated, and I find that very tasty, even as a concept, you know. So the practice of the Buddhist is to be ethical, which is getting wisdom, which is getting happiness. It's very interesting. I find that very empowering, very powerful, very holistic. So if the main job of being a Buddhist is, as Lama puts it, Lama Yeshe puts it so beautifully, is to be your own therapist, to be your own psychologist, to know your mind intimately. And that's exactly the point. That's when you really do apply actual Buddhist techniques. But before that, before you do that, we're not capable because our mind's so berserk. It's so programmed. We're so instinctively on a track of what we do. And because our body and speech, which I like to call the servants of our mind, are completely running the show, then the first job has to be you control your body and speech. It's kind of very obvious, but not maybe so obvious to us in our culture. You know, we tend to think, I'm allowed to say what I like. I'm allowed to think what I like. And so what we mean by that's really powerful. That's like saying, I'm allowed to eat anything I like. What you mean by that is that no matter what you eat, it won't have any consequences. But we know it's a dependent arising, that if you've got a certain kind of body, you cannot eat whatever you like. You know that certain food will harm you. And it's a really logical thing, and we understand this. It's very nuanced. So we would never say, I'm allowed to eat anything I like. Well, you are, but it might kill you. It's a contingent thing. That's the Buddhist view of the mind, which is quite a shock to us. We think this mind of ours is a special secret world in there that I'm allowed to do anything I like with. I can think what I like and have as many fantasies. I can imagine doing the most monstrous things. I'm allowed to do that because it's no one else's business, because we don't think it has consequences. We don't think that what we think brings any results, whereas the Buddha's view is so completely the opposite. It's like a joke. The Buddha's view is the exact opposite. Every millisecond of what goes on in our mind sows seeds in our mind that produces our future. That's the creation principle. As Dalai Lama said, and that's karma. That's all it means. As the Dalai Lama said, karma is like self-creation. So the Buddha's view is so insanely opposite, you can't believe it. That whatever we think and do, and therefore do and say, because the body and speech are just servants of what's in here. They just carry out the wishes of what's in here. That process is the process of creating karma. And every millisecond what we think and do and say sows seeds in our mind as a qualitative kind of seed that will produce our future experiences. That second, every single thing that's labelled negative will produce suffering, and everything called positive will produce happiness. So clearly the job of being a Buddhist, first, control your body and speech. Do not do negative things. Why not? Because I don't want suffering. And then two, once you harness your body and speech, junior school, now you can go to high school, now you can get some single point of concentration, now you can learn Buddha's model of the mind, and now you can start to unpack and unravel the contents in here and turn yourself into this marvellous person. That's the job of being a Buddhist. Then that's the wisdom wing, and now you can do the compassion wing, help others. That's the process, So I remember one time, this view that we think we can think what we like is so pervasive in our culture. It's really just beyond nihilism, in my opinion. It's kind of so shocking, I remember one time in my iPad looking up the New York Times, and there was this woman in Brooklyn who had gotten into her husband's computer and discovered that he was part of a cannibal site and they were preparing to kill and eat her. So she was quite shocked. She didn't call the police, she called the FBI. I mean, it must be more important to call the FBI, I'll never forget. But my point is this. His lawyers are meant to be intelligent. His lawyer, his defense was this, that he's allowed to think this. It does not mean that he will do it. In other words, we really believe in our culture that there is zero relationship between what goes on in our mind and what we do. I mean, if that's not schizophrenic, I don't know what is. Are you hearing me? And we say it with straight face. He's a lawyer and said it with a straight face. That shows how, it seems to me, how beyond disconnected we are from what goes on in our mind and the implications of what goes on in our mind. Because why? I think why is because we're so addicted to believing that I'm the product of someone else, my happiness comes from someone else, my suffering comes from someone else, and what I think and do and say has nothing to do with it. And that is what Lama Zopa said one time. That most humans on this planet have absolutely no idea that what goes on in our mind plays any role at all in our lives. I mean, that really almost seems too hard to imagine, but this is true. This is our view. This is how we think. This is our science. This is our psychology with respect to us. It's completely mind-boggling. You should think about it, What is the exact opposite? Whatever goes on in here is the main source of whatever I become. I'm the boss. Clearly the outside world plays an incredible, intimate and continuous role, but we give it all the power, whereas the Buddha puts it the other way around. Yes, the external is huge, but here is the boss. Here is the main cause. Here is where liberation is and where suffering is. This is the Buddha. It's a very interesting view, you know. And the other, and because you see also Buddha has no view like we have in our world, and which is in our creator religions, and I'm not being rude if you have faith in God, please don't misunderstand me, this dualistic view of punishment and reward. The view of karma, there's no concept of punishment and reward because there's no punisher and there's no rewarder. Whereas if you have the view of a creator, that's absolutely the definition of it. God runs the show. I remember talking to in Kathmandu, to some lovely Lutherans a long time ago. They came to want to know about Buddhism. And I mentioned the view of karma, and it was a really brilliant point the guy made. He said, how come there's not anarchy among Buddhists? Meaning, if there's nobody up there running the show, punishing and rewarding, what makes you behave? You get my point? That we need policing. And that's our culture as well. You might not be Christian, but that's your rule. That's the way our world works. Someone's always running the show. You've got the police, the judge, the ones who make the laws, your mother. We're looking over our shoulder. Who's telling us what to do, you know? Then we get all rebellious. Don't you tell me what to do. Buddha's telling us what to do, but he's not a boss. He's like a doctor who advises us from his own experience. If you do this and this, you'll get that result. So that's the attitude you'd have of the Buddha, not as a punisher. It's not his role, it's not his job, you know. But that's our view of morality. But you know, and it's in our religions and in our materialist world. You know, it's not just religion. Being a good girl is doing what someone else said, and being a naughty girl is breaking the laws. And that's why we don't want to be seen to break the laws. Oh, I got away with it, we think. That from Buddhism is demented. That's as mad as thinking because your doctor's not seeing you smoke, somehow you won't get cancer. We would laugh at that. We understand this stuff when it comes to ordinary things like health and playing music. We know we're the boss. We know that what we do brings consequences. If you play lousy music, you'll turn yourself into a lousy musician. It's absolutely obvious. If you put the wrong food in your body, you end up with an unhealthy body. We get that. But we don't get it when it comes to morality. We've got this whole different way of seeing. So complicated, so neurotic, you know. It's very fascinating. I'm allowed to do what I like. I'm allowed to think what I like. Who do you think you are telling me what to do, we say. Meaning we don't think there are consequences unless we're caught. It's very weird. For the Buddha, that's very schizophrenic. So this is why, if whatever I think and do and say produces me, and I know I don't want suffering, and I know I want happiness, then clearly I'm going to watch my body, speech, and mind like a hawk, and not sow seeds that will produce my suffering. It comes from self-respect, not from guilt, not from shame, not from self-hate, but from incredible self-respect, like eating good food because you want to have a healthy body. It's the same attitude. But it really takes time to hear this. It's not how we naturally think, you know. It's very interesting. Any questions, people? Let's go a bit more. You go, Chuck. Yeah.
Thank you. So in order to start this process of self-examination, in order to identify the seeds of suffering, be it anger, greed, sadness, should one sit with intention of identifying a specific thing, or should one sit and wait for what arises?
No. If you didn't know about health, but you decided you're going to take on a certain system, like acupuncture, wouldn't you? You know, you'd learn the theories first, wouldn't you? You'd have to learn the theories first. You can't start looking at your body because you don't know the theories yet, right? Would you agree with that? So the basics we're discussing here are the theories. You've got to learn the Buddhist model of the mind, how the mind functions. And I have to say, most people who label themselves Buddhist don't study it. So we just have these ideas of what we think anger is, what we think jealousy is. But everyone's got a different definition. But the Buddhist is very precise. And the key thing in Buddhist psychology is that all the emotions, I'm going to talk about this one more, we tend to think, when we say anger, we think emotion. When we think depression, we think inert But it's always when the body's involved. Well, that for the Buddha is just the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. And that's only when we notice that stuff. So we go by that, we're not looking at the mind at all in the way Buddha says. So when we understand, when we study the view about, when they study the monasteries, the model of the mind, you learn that all this stuff in our mind in here, this chaos in here, these thousands of raging on thoughts, right? There's millions of thoughts in there, aren't there? Even in Western psychology, they say there's like 1,000 thoughts a second. Buddha agrees with that. But we know it's just chaos. We can't hear one thought from another, can we? It's only when they're loud and shouting and your body's shaking that you realize you're angry. All of those emotions are just the tip of the iceberg. So we've got to start digging deep down, and we've got to begin to listen to the thoughts, but deeper down. That's why we've got to have concentration, but that's why we've got to listen to study the Buddhist model of the way these different states of mind function. What are these conceptual? They're all conceptual stories. So we're going to learn exactly what are the character of the negative stories and what's the character of the virtuous stories. And then we have to begin to hear them. And that's what just practice brings. So then you don't wait for them to arise. You know you've got them. You identify them. And then and as throughout the day, as you get better and better concentration, or even a bit more and more of awareness, but more and more understanding intellectually of the theories of what anger is, what jealousy is, what depression is, and all the good ones, then you start to unravel them. But the other crucial thing is to have the courage to not put the blame on the other person, which is our addiction, but to notice it when it arises, and then to be able to, even as you're walking in the street, driving the car, on the toilet, you're catching your mind all the time and you're identifying what's there. And that's the job. We just got to get better and better and better. Just like with acupuncture. When you first start thinking of acupuncture and you start thinking of a meridian, you haven't got a clue what a meridian is. You wouldn't have a clue where to begin. But as you keep going, you get better awareness. And then you can just look at a person and know what their health's like. So you've got to learn the theories first. And then that's the basis of knowing how to look in here and to identify what you're seeing. Do you understand? Mm. So the job is to distinguish the neuroses from the virtues. But the trouble, the biggest stumbling block for us, many stumbling blocks that prevent us from doing this, and it's our culture. One is we're not taught this as we're children. Because why? Because the second we wake up, until the second we go to sleep, what's our preoccupation? Out there. Because as far as we're concerned, that's the world, that's life. Out there is life, isn't it? The objects of our five senses. So we spend all our attention on that. So all our education is about that. I'm not criticising. All our education is about gardens and mountains and this and the sky and botany and music. Everything is external. Everything is about, and that's our genius in the modern world, is a sophisticated understanding of the external world, which is brilliant. So that's the world for us. But the part of us that knows that world, we haven't got a clue about. And that's the expertise we're just trying to describe here, the mind itself. So our first one is to have the wish to even know that we need to start have a model that describes this, and then learn to pay attention to it. And that's enormous. That's like reversing the energy of a bomb. And the second reason it's hard to do this job is because if we do start to notice what's going on here, it's when it's too late. It's when the Vesuvius is exploding. In other words, for me, the analogy is, and this is a dumb one, but it's very true, like you've never heard of mechanics, you've never heard of maintenance, you've never heard of the guy down the road who fixes your car. You just drive your car until everything collapses. And then you're 120 k's on the road, on the freeway, and oh, my wheels are falling off. What'll I do then? It's a little bit late. It's like laughable. But that's us with our emotions, because we only notice when I'm about to kill you, is when I notice I'm angry. But it's been going on all the time since I'm born. It's underneath, constant, these aversions, these stories, these dramas, building up 1,000 times a day, but I don't pay attention until it's too extreme. It's way too late. And that's when we go to therapy. And that's where we want to kill ourselves, or you, one or the other. But if we have these skills that enable us to see our mind before it gets to the emotional level, then your car you wouldn't have wheels falling off. And that's so shocking for us, because we take it as given that people have mental breakdowns and anxiety and depression, and it's just pervasive more and more now. It's not because we're getting worse in the world, it's because we don't know how to look in here. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that, I can guarantee you, even if you're a fairly normal person, I'm not being totally psychotic, extremely attached, extremely angry, or like one of my friends on death row, my dear friend Mitch, who's a Buddhist, he's getting ready for his death date, He's amazing. He's really practicing so hard now because he's getting his death date soon. I'm ready for that electric jolt, he said. One of the guys I know on death row who comes to the talks I give, and I know the guy, very relaxed, easygoing fellow, but as Mitch said, he thinks of torture all the time. Now, think of that kind of mind, you're really in trouble, you know. So for us, feeling the best thing we can think about all the time is food. I mean, look at us. That's our addictions, you know. Not torturing people. Aren't we lucky? So for even fairly ordinary people like us who are pretty pathetic and have crazy minds and get depressed and get anxious and up and down like yo-yos, join the universe, but fairly normal, if we really apply this stuff fairly sincerely, you know, I can say with confidence, at some point, you're able to handle what life brings you because you learn to notice what the hell is going on in here before it comes to the surface, and you're able to work with it to some degree. That's a fact. And the other thing is too, right now, because we wear our hearts on our sleeves, and as soon as something goes wrong, everybody knows about it because we're weeping and exhausted and look terrible because we don't know how to work with our minds, even when dramatic things happen. But you could say, you could argue, if you've got some semblance of self-respect, you're doing some kind of inner work. A person you haven't seen for 10 years comes along and your husband just died yesterday, you would be, I mean, I'm not trying to be exaggerating here, but you could imagine, knowing your own mind, you could still be able to say, how are you, Mary? And they'll say, how are you, darling? And you wouldn't vomit out all your feelings. We do that now because we have no way of knowing our own mind. We have no way of handling anything in here because we haven't learned the skills, which is why we desperately need therapists, which is fantastic. But the Buddha's approach is you can learn to work with your own mind well enough. And imagine if you start your life with that, you know, with techniques. You could say you could remain sane throughout your life, and I'm not exaggerating, even when bad things come, because you have a way of understanding it. Okay, again, I'm talking the Buddha's view here. You have the view about reincarnation, you have the view about death and impermanence, you have the view about karma, you have an explanation of why it happens, you have an explanation of what death is, all these things, you know, you have an explanation of why bad things happen, you have an explanation of why good things happen, and if you're working with those views and working on your own mind, then you can handle what life brings, because you have a way of describing it to yourself. You have a way of understanding it, you know. And all you've got, in other words, is a bunch of views. You've got a bunch of viewpoints that you choose to take on board. And that's our call, of course. Are we communicating here? People? Any other questions?
Radio.
Yes, sweetheart.
Thank you, Robina. I have a question about sadness and grief. And
Yeah.
I guess, you know, if you sort of observe that this is something that's a continual kind of thing. And
In your life, you mean?
Yeah. Because I know when you were just mentioning like the neurotic states of mind,
Yes.
then you said sadness.
I didn't mean it though.
Yeah,
That's not.
and you said
Yeah. No, I'll tell you why. Because I think some of the words we use, if you look in the list of, you know, you look at the list of things in Buddhist, the different states of mind, they narrow down to just a few neurotic ones and a few virtuous ones. There are obviously more variations of them all, but these we can all recognise are the key things, you understand? So I think some of the words we use, like the word grief, I don't think you're going to find a Tibetan word for that or for a Sanskrit word of that. So for me, that's a term that if you want to take, it's got some of the delusions and some of the virtues in it. It's a mix. It's a mix. So grief is when your heart is broken because your beloved has died, or your beloved's left you, one or the other, isn't it? So clearly, if you're an ordinary person, the source of that pain, a lot of that pain is called attachment, which is this natural, you've got a karmic connection with a certain person, your attachment depends upon that person, your attachment thinks they're going to cause you happiness, the attachment doesn't want them to leave you. I mean, this attachment is very deep in all of us. Join the universe here. We've all got it, you know? So it's a massive part of grief. So then you've got also just, you think about that person, like the Dalai Lama when he talked about his mum, and suddenly he had tears, because he was remembering her good qualities, this beautiful human being who brought him up, his enormous compassion for her and his love for her. So there's just some sadness there. But then the minute he was cracking jokes again, like his heart wasn't ripped out. Do you understand? So it can just be because you're close to that person, you remember their good qualities, and just he's not there anymore. I mean, it would just be heartbreaking. But you could argue a person who never gets over it, that's because it's mainly attachment. I remember a man I met years ago. His wife had died 5 years before, and he was he was beyond broken. He was just beyond broken, like every part of him had gone. That clearly is because of this unbelievable karmic connection with this person and his attachment and his inability to let go of it, you know, which is very normal. Now that would be the main thing, I'd say.
One other question, just...
But sad, I think, hang on. Sad, I think that's a very broad word. And I got a feeling sometimes as sadness we mean depression. And what depression is, and this really takes time to see, you know. Depression is internalized aversion. And aversion is what happens 1,000 times a day, even at the smallest level, when attachment doesn't get what it wants. This is really a very fascinating process. We don't think of it like this in our life. You know, basically the Buddha's saying, he's identified, in Buddhist psychology, this sounds hilarious, 84,000 distinct different negative states of mind, meaning the term they use in Sanskrit, afflictions, problems. What kind of problems? Mental problems. You know, there's 84,000. But luckily he narrows it down to like 3. The three poisons, he calls them. We can call them the 3 toxic emotions, a great modern term. And then there's a whole bunch more of those. When you learn the texts, you learn 20 secondary this and 3 this and 5 this and 6 that. There's a whole bunch of these different states of mind. And they've all got this, in the Buddhist model, they've all very intimately related to each other. You can kind of, this whole massive map you'd have. Some are related to attachment, some relate to aversion, some relate to this. It's a very intricate and very coherent, actually, presentation of the contents of the mind. And that's what Buddhist psychology is about. Whereas our psychology, as an added point here, just for a second, is so mixed up with who did it to you, what is it, the brain, the DNA, the genes, the external conditions. That's not the Buddhist concern at all. It's just the states of mind themselves. This is so unusual. And we can't even hear this initially. They're the actual conceptual stories themselves. This is a very elaborate presentation of them, It's very fascinating and how they're all linked to each other. So these 3 toxic emotions, 3 poisons as he calls them, he narrows them, they're all subsumed down to these 3. All those 84,000 subsumed to these 3. And it's really fascinating. There's a hierarchy between them. There's an intimate relationship between these 3. The root one, as they call it, the root delusion, the root mental illness, the root mental affliction, is known as simply, I'm getting to sadness here now, is simply called ignorance, a very particular kind of specific ignorance. Ignorance in particular about the nature of your own self. And that's where Buddha diverged from the Hindus, in the relation to exactly what the self is. All the Buddhist teachings, that's the wisdom wing, lead to exactly his view of exactly what the self is. Everything comes to that. It's very fascinating. So this ignorance is this root delusion, so primordial, so instinctive, so utterly, completely there, and so ancient, that we don't have a word for it in our psychology, I'd suggest. In fact, what it asserts, this ignorance, what it asserts is this neurotic sense of a separate, bereft, unhappy me. That's even a given for us, in our culture. But the Buddha says this main delusion that we can uproot. That's when we achieve liberation, when we've got that out, the subtlest one. So on the basis of this sense of a separate, bereft, concrete, solid me-ness, which is so utterly primordial, utterly assumed as true, we don't notice it. On the basis of that, its main voice is this emotional hunger that I'm missing something. Therefore, we crave something. All this is attachment. This is called attachment. It's emotional hunger, dissatisfaction. I'm not enough. No matter what I get, it's not enough. No matter what I do, not enough. No matter what I achieve, not enough. No matter how much Chuck tells me he loves me, it's not enough. It's the default assumption of this suffering of attachment. So then always it naturally craves something out there, which of course is the 5 sense objects, such that when we get it, it'll fill us up. That attachment is massive, but a most fundamental way of putting this attachment is it's an assumption. It's the main voice of ego grasping, and it's an assumption. It's a frantic, fear-based, panic-stricken assumption every second of the day that I must get what I want every second. Now, I know that sounds really brutal, but keep remembering, Buddha's not criticizing us. He's pointing out what's causing us suffering. He says we should be weeping in compassion for ourselves when we recognize this, That's the default assumption throughout the day. Now, the point is this. The third one, that's the response when that attachment is thwarted. Or when the attachment does get what it wants, but then it changes into suffering. So this attachment and aversion, we run between these like drunken maniacs 1,000 times a day, but at levels of ordinariness that we don't even think they're a problem. And that's the tragedy. So in other words, attachment is always this assumption, I must get what I want. That means I must get the nice sound, the nice weather, the nice warmth, the nice thing, the nice heater, the nice mattress, the nice bathroom, the nice everything that we expect, which is the grossest level is discomfort. getting the things that I want. And because we're so brilliant at that in our culture, you just switch a button and you get the right temperature, the right food, the right coffee. I mean, that's incredible. So our attachment is constantly wanting that, constantly. But even more subtle than that. It even just, like even when you're washing the dishes, I was just this dumb example. You're doing the dishes and you drop a cup. I've never met anybody who doesn't get upset when they drop a cup washing the dishes. And what's that mean? That means attachment, this primordial assumption that only the good things should happen. Another way of putting it. You're not supposed to drop a cup because you have mummy over your shoulder or somebody from the past, you're not supposed to drop a cup. So you curse yourself. That's called anger. So attachment, just that moment, only wants everything to be perfect. Attachment is a control freak that only wants everything to be perfect. We've all got this. And the second it doesn't get what it wants, we get upset. So anger is the third one, the three. Ego grasping, the mistake in the first place, it sends a separate ridiculous I, is always hungry, so it wants everything to be perfect, wants what I want all the time, and manipulates and spends all day trying to get that. Inexorably and inevitably it won't get what it wants 1,000 times a day. So then the third one arises, and that's called aversion. But there's a whole spectrum of those. There's anger, the volatile shout, yell, mild levels of it, irritated, annoyed, upset, frustrated. And then depression and despair, internalized. They're all the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants. That means attachment wants, again, attachment wants everything to be perfect. Attachment wants everything to be the way I want them to be. This is the voice of attachment. And it's so normal, the universe has it. And this is the source of all our suffering. And then when it doesn't get what it wants, it gets upset. Now, if if you're the kind of person who shouts and yells when your attachment doesn't get what it wants, the world knows you've got a problem. It's called anger. But what if you just have mild versions of it? All day, when a person who's called depressed is the kind of person who has good behavior and doesn't shout. I admire that person. But they are going to have their attachment not get what it wants in the same way as an angry person, but it doesn't become volatile. They go, oh, I should have done that. Oh, that's no good. But it's internalized. It's internalized. And every time you drop the cup, it's internalized. Every time something goes wrong, the loud noise, the thing doesn't happen, you get a pain in your knee, aversion arises. Aversion arises. Now, the point is this. Buddha says every single tiny thing that goes on in our mind, none of it goes astray, as everything is like stored like a picture in the mind. Everything's stored like a memory. So all day, you're having these mild little panic attacks of things not going well, but you don't pay attention to them. But they've all built up. And one day, 50 years later, you're inert in bed and you've got to go to a therapist and unpack your life. Are you communicating here? Because we don't deal with what arises in our mind second by second by second unless it's violent. Then you think you've got a problem. So we don't notice our mind till it's way too late, in other words. Are you with me, people? So this Buddhist skill is so practical. It's not mystical, it's not holy, it's not religious, it's unbelievably practical. And Buddha says you can change your mind. That's the miracle. And what are you changing? So it's peculiar. What do you mean change your mind? We can't get that. It means hearing the conceptual story called anger. Or just when you drop the cup. You curse yourself. You catch it right there. This is a baby example. You catch it. Give it a break, Robina. It's fine. Drop another cup, baby. It's cool. You just dealt with it. So it's now gone. Instead of cursing yourself and then forgetting it, and then cursing yourself 3 minutes later, and then getting mad at the driver on the road, and by the end of the day you wonder why you're exhausted. Because of what's going on in your mind. Attachment, aversion, attachment, aversion. And then all the other delusions, jealousy and all the others, are all branches of attachment and aversion. These are the fundamentals, you know. This is not how we think in the West. This is not the model we use in our culture. We have these fancy words for everything, you know. Half of them are Greek as well. Schizophrenic, paranoia, psychotic. These are English words. Any questions from people? Anyway, sadness. Okay, sadness. Sadness is a big function of depression. It doesn't mean every time it's like that, but it's a big function of depression. Kind of this funk, you know, a bit sort of sad, you know. Because when you're attached, you're all excited. When attachment is working nicely, you're all perky and excited. So sadness is deflated attachment sort of thing. And it can be real depression when it's kind of become inert, you know. But sadness can also just become, sadness can be compassion. So for me, we use it very broadly. Sadness is compassion. You see people suffering and you're sad. That's compassion, people. That's fantastic. You know, so we've got to really be able to identify what it is more accurately, you know. And the key one key factor, this is again we're not familiar with, the character of the neuroses is disturbing. It's disturbing. You're disturbed. And the character of virtue is you're not disturbed. So that's where, for example, if I say I love Chuck, what I'm really saying most of the time is I'm attached to Chuck. And I think Chuck's divine. So I do also love him on top. Love is a virtue. And the ones we love are the ones we're attached to. So a mother loves her child, meaning wants her child to be happy. That's love. That's incredible. But the attachment to that child, it completely pollutes that love, you know. So my attachment to Chuck, which means my expectations of what he should do, my expectation he should make me happy, and that's really massive. It's like this maniac in here that believes he is the cause of my happiness and demands that he do what my attachment wants and will have a panic attack when he doesn't. That attachment is fierce, so that I'll manipulate him to do exactly what I want. That's what attachment does. Control freak is a great term for attachment. It's this incredible genius manipulator that will make sure he does exactly what my attachment wants. That's what attachment is. It's a brilliant, clever person, attachment. So then, of course, I'm going to say I love him. I adore him. I want you to be happy. And I do. But as Lama Zopa says, it's unstable. Or as we'd say, it's got strings attached. So when he starts not doing what my attachment wants, my love will turn off like a tap. Of course it will. And the difference is that's the job. We have to distinguish between the attachment and the love. And in the beginning, when it's there, it's like impossible to know the difference because they're completely merged. It's like water and milk mixed together. That's how profoundly deep they both are. We can't distinguish. So that's why in your daily life, like just with a chocolate cake, we can't distinguish between simply attachment to it, manipulating, greedy, grasping, and merely enjoying chocolate cake, liking chocolate cake. You know, Tibetans prefer their yak cheese. That's what they've been brought up with. Australians prefer our Vegemite. But attachment to it is another discussion. But we can't tell the difference. So the sign that it's attachment, and this is what to watch for in your mind, is if you get upset. A polite version of aversion. The second if he does not what my attachment wants, and I get upset or annoyed, that's the sign that it was coming from attachment and not love. Do you understand? Like I always use that simple example. I say Chuck and I go to the cafe and we order chocolate cake. We both look like we like chocolate cake and we look equal. But look at the response when carrot cake comes. And that will be the proof of whether one of us has attachment or not. So if I get upset, that proves I've got attachment and I was expecting chocolate cake. He might go, oh, that's cool, I can handle carrot cake. That proves he was, either that he was attached but he changed his mind, or that he's flexible. So it's only when attachment doesn't get what it wants that you notice it was attachment. You almost can't catch it until then. And that's why we've got to watch our minds like a hawk. And when you really know your mind deep, then you can see that attachment. But it's incredibly subtle, incredibly sneaky, you know. What was your other question?
Oh, just last night when you were talking about, you know, if you look at the path that we're sort of on, with regards to the natural world.
Sorry, I'm lost.
Well, there was a question, and it was about, I guess, you know, is our planet in big
yeah. Where were you? You said it. Yours, wasn't it? What's your name again? Bill's point. Yeah, Bill's point. So go on. You go on. Then. Then.
Well, I guess my question is that my sense is that there's a lot of collective grief
about the planet.
Yeah.
We're all sad. We see it all broken. And Bill's point.
Yeah.
So go on. What's the point? What's the question?
And the question is, like, I know it's important to work on your mind, but how can working on your mind actually help that?
Because if you're practicing giving up attachment and giving up greed and giving up jealousy and giving up anger and developing wisdom, and if you want to add to that the view of karma, then you'll at least have an interpretation of why it is the way it is, and then you'll be, because you're more sane and more clear and not neurotic, you'll find means to want to help it, because as you get less attached and less angry, you're going to get more compassionate. So if you stay sane and clear, and you have the Buddhist view is the karmic view, then you'll know why it's that way, and then you'll go, how can I help? But then you'll also realize maybe it's too late. you can't help much. And you don't get despairing about that. You do what you can. You do what you can. You do what you can, you know. Okay. Isn't it? Yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean, so let's look at Bhutan. I mean, Bhutan have got a government that's reasonable, so they control tourism. I mean, you're never going to see that in Nepal. Apparently the government's so corrupt, has been for so long, you can't even get anything done. But Bhutan clearly has a reasonable government, so you can say that's the collective karma of the Bhutanese. They've got this reasonable government, it seems, and they can control the way their country is visited, which is very intelligent. But when you know that's not going to happen in Nepal, there's no point in getting depressed about it. It's inexorable and inevitable. There's going to get more and more people. Over the last, I mean, when I first came to Kathmandu, not even that long ago, okay, 40 years ago, and you look out over the hills, and there was not a single house. Yeah. You know, it was clear and beautiful. There was hardly any pollution. You'd hardly 10 years before that, when some of my friends first went to Nepal, they had to bring a car from India over the mountains. There was no cars here. Only 50 years ago, you know. Yeah, right. And look at Kathmandu now. Yeah. But what's fascinating, nevertheless, you ask any Tibetan, they think Kathmandu is the most blessed, blissful place on the planet. So again, talk about view, isn't it? Yeah. They see something more than just that. Right. So it's kind of, there's many other things, but it's true. I mean, it's inevitable. It's the way the world is, you know. That's where we've got to stay perky and be optimistic and do what we can to be a reasonable person, and then fight no matter how bad things get, never give up. I think that's the key one. When you give up, when you get despairing, then you just want to kill yourself. But for me, it seems like if it's the way the world is, I kind of joke and say, even if you're drowning, you might as well stay optimistic. I mean, why be miserable, you know? Bad enough to drown, why be miserable as well? I mean, that's a really interesting approach to put, but it's kind of practical. Because when you're not freaking out, at least you might find an option to do something, you know? And that's what comes from working on your own mind, isn't it? Right. Do you see my point? Yeah. Instead of if only and why not and how dare, which is never going to get us anywhere. Just despairing, isn't it? Yeah. What else, Pete? Was it dinner time yet?
Yep.
Yes. Is it real? It's 6 o'clock already.
6:30.
6:30. Oh, that's dinner. 6:30.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have one question, then we can finish. Yes. Sweetheart.
When you talk about this optimism and not freaking out, would that be part of what you refer to as the Vajrayana view?
No, that's the Bodhisattva view. Okay. That's the body. You know, we'll go into this. This is the compassion wing. The compassion wing is on the basis of putting yourself together to some degree. You now start to go, oh my God, look at the world. We're all suffering. We're all doing the crazy things. We're all insane. We're all mad. What can I do to help? And as you grow more and more confident that you know you can change your own mind, so you become more content and more wise and more stable. And then you see the suffering and you go, if I don't help, who will? They say the Bodhisattva is like a person who it's like a mother for their child. It's their job description. So then with that comes optimism. No matter how bad things get, what can I do to help? No matter how bad it is, what can I do? And that's optimism, and that's enthusiasm. So you never give up. Because I mean, the Bodhisattva view anyway, the Buddhist view anyway, your mind is endless. So no point in giving up. And the Bodhisattva view is no matter how many lifetimes it takes, you're going to keep working on yourself, and becoming a Buddha and helping others. So it brings enormous optimism, enormous enthusiasm. You're clear, you're crystal clear, you see the nightmare, but it just never drags you down, eventually. Never, never, never. So way to go, isn't it?
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let's have dinner. So we just think of this little few minutes we've been talking, whatever it is, all these thoughts gone in, and something's useful, great. If not, leave it on the back burner, that's okay. So we've sown these seeds again, you know, thinking how fantastic. Maybe nourish these seeds with our own efforts, our own practice, the way we see the world, to develop our marvellous potential so we can help others. And then think about dinner. Think of those porters you have to, I mean, you know, when we had our helicopter today, you saw these little veggie patches, you know? Yeah. Everywhere you go, little veggie patches, grabbing them, taking their... So we think of these people who grew the veggies, little creatures who died in the veggie patches, little ants that got squashed. We think of the people who cooked it, the porters who lugged it up the hills, you know. All these kind people who make our dinner. How kind. To have that view for dinner instead of attachment. And think we're going to eat so we can be fat and healthy, so we can continue to work on ourselves so we can be of benefit to others and we can repay the kindness of sentient beings.